Hello, everyone. You're listening to The Right Side of Gaming. Adding guest from yesterday's video, today we're going to be talking about all the blue spells in Magic Legends. Blue has a lot of crowd control, a lot of draw spells, a lot of taking control of enemy creatures, and a lot of a sorcery focus. I want you to keep that in mind as we're going through everything. Start with, we have the Deep Root Stalker, which has hexproof, so it can't be directly targeted by enemies. That means it can still be damaged by AoEs or your little area traps and things like that. Enemy creatures won't be going out of their way to attack it directly. Next, we have Muse Drake, which will draw a spell when it's summoned, which means it will automatically replace itself. It will also trigger anything that requires you to draw a card. We can actually contrast Muse Drake with Stitch Drake, which will draw you a spell when it dies. So Stitch Drake is good for your sacrifice type decks, but you're going to get the effect regardless, because sooner or later it's going to die. But it's a nice sort of mirror to Muse Drake. They even have the power toughness mirrored. Muse Drake is a 1/3, Stitch Drake is a 3/1. We also have Homored Warrior, has an activated ability, which is if the spell is in your hand while you already have Homored on the field, instead of casting another Homored Warrior, you're going to activate that ability. So this ability gives Homored Warrior plus X plus 0, where X is its toughness for 8 seconds. Now blue does have some creature buffs, especially ones that target toughness. If white is a more aggressive creature color, blue wants to buff their creatures and use them a little more defensively. So you can buff up the toughness of Homored Warrior just using blue spells, but even without any type of other buff, activating that ability will cause it to be a 6/3, which isn't bad. Next we have Alchemic Thumaturge, which says that your sorceries cost 25% less mana, so it will reduce the cost of your sorceries, which is great in those sorcery-oriented decks. Even if you don't want to run creatures in there, this is a great one to slip in just because it makes all of them so much cheaper. Next we have Spawning Bed, which I think is a fun way to do sort of defensive creatures in blue as well as sort of mass creatures. So you're going to summon 5 Chimera eggs, which, they have 2 toughness, but they have no power, so they're not going to really be damaging anything. But they will occasionally sacrifice a random egg to create a 1/1 Chimera creature. So they're going to soak up some damage and then randomly hatch, is what we're looking at, which is really flavorful, if nothing else. It's also good for those go wide decks because, hey, you now have 5 eggs, and if you paired that up with something that would buff, power, I think it'd be hilarious to see a bunch of eggs hopping around smashing people. Next we have Illusory Allies, which creates 3 illusions, 1/2 illusion soldiers. If Banalish Archers is sort of like the white version, this is the blue version. It's creating 1/2s instead of 1/1s, but it's about the same cost. And the idea is just to get a bunch of small bodies on the board. Next we have Academy Wizard. Academy Wizard is great for decks that want to really focus on card draw and card draw triggers. Blue has a lot of those, and a lot of them tend to be sorceries, although we do see some where it's not, tied to a sorcery. Like we saw the Muse Drake, where you can get some card draw and still have it attached to a body, but you're probably not going to have a whole lot of creatures in a draw deck. Well, Academy Wizard says whenever you draw 1 or more spells, it's going to create a 1/1 illusion token. This is a great way to still do your draw sorceries and still get some bodies out on the board. Next we have one of our mythics, Evolvazoa, which I'm not entirely sure I'm saying right, but it has Regenerate, and the idea is every time it dies, it comes back bigger, at least to a certain point. So it starts off as a 1/1 with Regenerate, and when it dies, it becomes a 2/3 Megazoa with Regenerate, and when that Megazoa dies, it becomes a 4/5 Gigazoa. So, it's going to stay out on the field longer than some of the other creatures because it will be able to regenerate multiple times. But once you get to that 4/5 stage, if it dies, well, it's gone. But by then, hopefully, you've drawn back into Evolve a Zoa, and you've got another one out in the field to sort of start the chain over again. Next, we have Homored Shaman, whose activated ability is Draw a Spell. So if you have Homored Shaman out in the field, you can pay and just sort of discard this to get another spell. They don't have the cost in here, but if memory serves, it was a pretty cheap ability to activate. So it's just an easy way to sort of replace it and get something else. Of course, you can always keep it in your hand if you decide you want to cast it again, but otherwise you can just sort of cycle through. Next, we have Water Elemental. Whenever you summon it, it has sort of this black hole effect. It pulls nearby enemies towards it and briefly knocks them down. So you get a little CC, and you can use it to sort of get enemies out of your way. In the game, it's really easy to get creatures sort of mobbed up around you. This will sort of, create a little breathing room for you. Next is Mage Captivator. Whenever you summon it, you're going to take control of an enemy creature until Mage Captivator leaves the battlefield or combat ends. Now, a lot of these sort of take control effects will have a specific duration. This one doesn't. Of course, this is only taking control of one creature instead of multiple creatures. So it doesn't necessarily have to have that, say, 8-second time limit or anything like that. It's just going to be one creature for an extended period of time, which is a fair trade-off. Next, we have Lorekeeper Sphinx. Is a 3/6 normally, but it gains +X+0, where X is the number of spells in your hand. So you're always going to be somewhere between a 3/6 and a 7/6. Okay? In the card game, like the physical card game, you can have a ton of cards in your hand. There's really no limit. If you want to keep them, that's a separate issue. But there's ways around that. In Magic Legends, you're only ever going to get up to 4 cards in your hand. So it doesn't quite have that unlimited size buff that you can get. Still, that means assuming you have cards in your hand, it's going to be somewhere between a 4/6 and a 7/6 because it's blue. You're going to have a lot of card draw. If you have an empty hand, it's probably not going to last long. But chances are, it's going to have some little boost in there. It has a special ability that will deal damage and knock enemies back. Next, we have Avatar of Frost, which is one of our bigger creatures. I mean, this is 10 mana. But whenever you summon it, it's going to stun enemies in a little AoE. And it has a special ability that can trigger that will deal damage and stun them again. So you can have some ongoing stuns with this, which is great in blue because we'll see ways to sort of take advantage of those stun effects. Next, we have Glint. For 10 seconds, your creature with the lowest percentage of health gains +0/+3 in hexproof. I want to point out this is lowest percentage of health, not lowest health. If you have a 1/1 out in the field and this 5/7, it's not automatically going to target the 1/1. If the 1/1 is at full health, but this 5/7 is at half health, the 5/7 is going to be the one that gets the buff because we're looking at the percentage of health it has left. And if the target has 50% or less of its maximum health, you're also going to draw a spell, which will basically just replace Glint. Next, we're going to have Magnetic Pulse. It's going to be another one of those sort of black hole effects they can use to sort of get creatures out of your way. And this one is really good about keeping them there for a couple seconds if you want to set up a combo or get them grouped up for another AoE, because this is going to deal damage, pull enemies to that target location, and it's going to root them for 2 seconds, which means they won't be able to move out of that way. Next, we have Mass Manipulation. This has 2 X's in its cost, and if you remember, X means that you can hold down the casting button to spend more mana. In this case, you have 12 mana total in your bar, so X can be anywhere from 1 to 5, because you have to spend twice X basically, and you have 12 mana total, so 2 of those go for the blue, and then you can get up to 5 and 5 for 12. Okay, so you have sort of this 1 to 5 range that you can spend, and you're going to take control of enemy creatures in an area around you for 10 seconds, and you can buff that area up basically 5 times, and you're going to take control of everything. So compare this to our Lol Mage Captivator. You're going to be getting, well, you're going to be spending a lot more mana first, most likely, but you're going to be getting multiple creatures for a shorter, limited period of time. I also need to note, and we'll see this on a lot of these that have this kind of effect, that the duration is reduced on powerful foes. So if you try to use this on, say, an elite creature, it's not going to stick around for as long. Next, we have Mist Form. So for 4 seconds, you have Greater Swiftness, which is going to increase your speed, your movement speed, immunity to control effects, and the ability to pass through foes. We're also going to apply a lesser snare to enemies you pass through for 5 seconds. So you're going to be able to move really quick and sort of get out of the way and even go through mobs. Because again, a lot of times you'll have creatures that are blocking your way or they'll mob around you and it's really hard to get out. This is kind of your, screw that button. You're going to go really quick through it all. And if you go through one of those enemies, you're going to slow them, so they're not going to be able to chase after you as well. Next, we have Telestrike. So it's going to disorient nearby enemies for 8 seconds, which, if you remember, is where they can't do anything. They're not going to be attacking you or moving unless you damage them. So it's sort of like that soft CC. If you hit them, they are uncontrolled. But until then, you can have them controlled for up to 8 seconds. So after you disorient them, you're going to teleport to target location. So you're disorienting everything near you before you teleport. Then you're teleporting somewhere else, and you're dealing damage to enemies at the target location. Which, if you target yourself in more or less the same spot, you can sort of use it as an AoE damage. Or you can use it as sort of a, I just want to get away from here type of deal. And when it deals damage, it's going to deal additional damage to enemies affected by a control effect. So if you do target it on the enemies you just disoriented, you're dealing double damage against them, basically. But you just have some flexibility in how you're using it. Next, we have Chronosphere. You're going to create a hazard at a target location for 6 seconds, and enemies in the hazard have greater slow and greater snare. They're going to be slowed and they're not going to attack as fast. Whereas allied creatures in the hazard have greater haste and greater swiftness, so they're going to move and attack faster. We have Psionic Shatter. It's going to deal a pretty decent amount of damage to enemies in a line. And when it crits, it's going to deal additional damage to enemies affected by a control effect. And you'll draw a spell to replace it. I do want you to note that we've seen some others where they had the critical effect that would deal an additional 100% damage, like our Telestrike up here. Deals 100% additional damage. Psionic Shatter only deals 50% additional damage, so if that matters to you, it's just something to keep in mind. It's still doing extra damage to enemies that are controlled, which is something you want to do in blue anyway. It's just you're not getting that really big damage boost compared to some of the other critical effects. Sleep is going to disorient it, enemies at a target location for 8 seconds. Remember, you can break it with damage, but there's no damage attached to this one, so you don't have to worry about doing that accidentally. It's purely a control effect. Next, we have another one of our mythics, Time Unravel, which you might not be able to pull off in the card game, but you can definitely do in Magic Legends. It's going to give you greater swiftness, so it's going to have really increased movement speed for 3 seconds, and then after those 3 seconds are up, you're going to return to the amount of life and mana you had upon casting the spell. So you can pop it and run really quick through a bunch of enemies, and yeah, you're going to lose some life, but you're going to get that life back. And you're going to get back the mana you spent to cast the spell. It's just sort of another way to sort of get out of the way of everything. Now it's another one of your sort of escape spells. We have Talarian Winds. You're going to discard all the spells in your hand and then draw that many spells. If you don't have any other spells in your hand, you're probably not going to draw anything, but you're in blue, you're probably always going to have at least a couple spells. This is a great way to sort of dig through your deck, especially if you have a combo you would like to pull off. And even if you don't really have anything else in your hand, you're still going to get lesser swiftness out of the deal. You're going to get that regardless, which is going to be a small increase in movement speed. But it's a great way to not only trigger a bunch of draw effects, but, you know, I think I at least like pulling off little combos when I can in the game, so this is a great way, I think, to sort of dig through those a bit. Another good one, Concentrate. You're going to draw 3 spells, so even if this was the only card in your hand, you're still going to be up to 3 spells, and you have a 40% chance to draw an additional spell, and when that triggers, you basically are always going to have a full hand from that. We have Frost Armor. You're going to gain a shield for 5 seconds, and while it is active, you're going to stun enemies that damage you. And if there's any shield left after that, you're going to deal damage and stun nearby enemies. You have a little damage mitigation. You have a stun that's going to work on anyone that hits you, and then if it's still up, you're going to damage and stun them again. We have Icicle, which is going to deal damage to enemies in a line and stun them for 4 seconds. We've seen pretty much this exact effect before in white. We have Dominate, which you'll notice is a lot cheaper than, say, Mass Manipulation because it's only going to be one enemy creature and take control of one enemy creature, but it's going to be for longer. It's going to be for 15 seconds. You're going to have reduced duration on powerful foes again, so you're not going to be able to take control of your elites and stuff for as long. You have Icy River. You're going to charge forward and create a hazard that deals damage to enemies inside it over 5 seconds. And it's going to create a hazard that will slide enemies forward and give them lesser snare, so reduced movement speed. It's another way to sort of get you to a different spot, another one of those sort of escape maneuvers. And you're also going to have a lesser snare, a reduced movement on anything that tries to follow you. Next we have Tidal Wave. You're going to deal damage to foes in front of you, and that's in front of you is a decent width, so it's not like this really narrow line. I mean, you have a decent amount of space that you're going to be doing this AoE on. You're going to be dealing damage to enemies in front of you, and you're going to create a hazard for 10 seconds that's going to give enemies in it lesser snare, that reduced movement speed. Next we have Tornado, which still bugs me and makes me a little salty because in the card game it's a green card, but no, we're going to focus on the blue one in Magic Legends today. You create a moving hazard in front of you that deals damage to enemies inside it over 5 seconds, and enemies in the hazard are pulled along with it. So basically, you're going to make this tornado that's going to be moving around, and if it runs into an enemy, it's basically going to pick them up and drag them with it, and it's going to deal damage to them as it moves around. Basically, they're going to get stuck in a tornado. It's flavorful, even if it still bugs me that it's the wrong color. I mean, it fits for blue, but still. Next, we have Phantasmagoria, which is a sorcery. You're going to create a hazard at a target location that's going to deal damage to enemies inside of it and give them greater weakness, which means they're going to deal less damage. We've talked a bit before about damage mitigation. Now, normally it's in the form of, say, heals that heal a person after they've taken damage, or shields, which prevent them from taking damage. Greater weakness is technically another form of that, because you're reducing the damage that the players and their summons are going to take. Next we have Thought Cadence, one of our enchantments. For 30 seconds, whenever you cast a spell of a different type than the last spell you cast, draw a spell. If I cast a sorcery first and then I cast a creature, I'm going to draw a spell. It sort of rewards you for diversifying your deck up a bit, for having at least some cards of different types in there. Conversely, I want to skip down to Spellstorm real quick, one of our other mythics, for kind of a different take on enchantments. Spellstorm says for 30 seconds, whenever you cast a sorcery, you're going to gain a storm counter up to a maximum of 3. Sorceries, you cost 1 less for each storm counter you have, and note that that's 1 generic mana. So if you were to cast something like Phantasmagoria, yeah, it's going to get down to a 1 and 2 blue. But if you were to cast something like Dominate, again, you're only reducing the generic mana by the looks of it, which means it's still going to cost 3 blue. But it also has this remove all storm counters if a sorcery is not cast for 3 seconds. So whereas Thought Cadence wants you to cast a lot of different types of cards, Spellstorm rewards you for casting the same types of cards, for doing a very sorcery heavy deck. I mean, it might be possible to pull off both in the same deck. I don't know. I have to really pay attention to how fast you can cast things, because you would basically have to do sorcery, non-sorcery, sorcery, really quick within 3 seconds. But they both lend themselves to completely different deck types. Finally, we have Psychic Barrier. For 30 seconds, creatures you control gain +0/+3 as long as you have 3 more spells in hand. I think they meant to say 3 or more spells in hand. But this really plays to sort of that more defensive focus on creatures that blue does. And you can see how that combos really well with like the Homored we saw earlier, where it gets a buff based on its toughness. Okay, well, it goes from a 3/3 to a 3/6, and then because it gets a +6, you can use that activate ability to make it a 9/6. Okay, so you can really see how some of that defensive buff can kind of stack up and really gets played around with in blue. That's all we have for today. It's all the spells. Again, you'll notice that there's a lot of focus on sorceries, a lot of focus on control effects, a lot of focus on card draw, and some I'm going to steal your creatures effects. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you'd like to leave a like, comment, subscribe, that'd be great. If not, that's okay too. I understand. Either way, I hope you have an awesome day, and I will catch you next time.